let's start just talking about your experience in Washington so far. We think you've hit the ground running, and you're a super freshman. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, so it's helpful that I did serve on the Hill as a staffer because it's a lot, right? You take that oath of office, and this year was a unique year. It was in the middle of a government shutdown. It was in the aftermath of the Merrimack Valley gas explosions, and so we had no choice but to hit the ground running. We had constituent services that were up and running on day one, answering the phones and solving cases, right? Just getting really scrappy about where to go to for resources and help. And it in Washington, the same thing. We didn't get distracted by a lot of the, there's plenty of distraction in Washington. But, we knew we wanted to get on Armed Services Committee and the Education and Labor Committee. We knew that that's where we were going to do a bunch of our work, whether it's helping innovation thrive here in Massachusetts through the relationship it has with the DoD and the Pentagon, or I ran on making college more affordable, opening up lanes for our vocational and technical high schools and our community colleges. So we just put our head down and we stayed focused on what we needed to do those first few months. And so I'm glad you translated that into hit the ground running, because it was by design.
Yeah, perfect. Well, you just alluded to the Merrimack Valley settlement. That's come through. Can you talk a little bit about what the next steps are?
Sure. Yeah. So there was a $143 million settlement for families and businesses affected by the Columbia gas explosions back in September of last year. It by no means cures the pain of the region, but it's helpful, right? I mean, people need to access these resources. There will be awards given by the plaintiffs' attorneys, and so we're going to monitor that closely to make sure that folks are getting what they deserve, and that these businesses are continued to be made whole. We've been intimately involved in the claims process and helping facilitate that throughout this process. And then certainly we've been involved in making sure another explosion like this never happens again. We've filed legislation with Senator Markey, making sure that we have a pipeline safety bill, and then we've got standards in place based on the lessons we learned in Lawrence, Andover, and North Andover. And then I'd just say one thing. I know Marlborough is a ways away from the impacted communities, but there is a concerted effort by folks up here to ensure that we get back to supporting those businesses. It's called Rock the Register. But if there's anything that we could do with our discretionary income, it's, support a business that, has just had a really tough year. And whether it's a restaurant or a bodega in Lawrence or, a gift shop in North Andover, they really benefit from, seeing that, business come back.
We'll stick with the Merrimack theme and talk a little bit about the Merrimack River. Back in May, you introduced legislation to support the cleanup of rivers, and that's throughout the country. But let's talk a little bit about the Merrimack River itself.
Yeah, so in my lifetime, I've seen the Merrimack, sort of get clean, right? To the extent that folks are swimming in it, and it's the drinking water for 600,000 residents in the area. To now, that's being threatened. There's 800 million gallons of raw sewage getting dumped into that river on an annual basis. Municipalities can't keep up with those investments that need to be made because they're to the tune of billions of dollars to these wastewater treatment facilities. And so I have a bill. It's the Combined Sewerage Overflow Stop Sewerage Act. And it turns out there are people all over the country that need investment in their infrastructure, in their water infrastructure. And if you just step back and think about how vital and how basic clean air and clean water are to our communities, these are investments that the federal government should be making. In fact, in my lifetime, the reason why the Merrimack became so clean was because of federal dollars flowing and making those investments. And so I think it's there's a lot of pressure right now on cities and towns, and they can't afford it. Even the state revolving fund that we have for water, it's a loan program we're making that a grant program, and we're increasing it from 0 to $91 million. And this hopefully will be a model. It's not just for the Merrimack River. This is for water infrastructure everywhere. And you're right to point out the first vote that I got to see convert into full passage was on the largest land and water conservation bill in decades, and that preserved the Nashua River and restored it as a wild and scenic river. And that's so important to our communities, especially our urban areas where kids need that. They need to be outside and taking advantage of their natural resources.
Now, I know one of your top priorities is opioid, the drug abuse and all that. What do you want to see happen to get really to a point where we're seeing a lot of improvement in that area?
I want to see the level of investment that we infused into the AIDS epidemic in the 80s, right? I mean, I want us to confront and eradicate this epidemic. And it does take, an infusion to the tune of 10, 20, $50 billion. If we're not going to do that, if we have to wait for that, there's definitely things that we can do right now that aren't controversial and that, frankly, don't cost money. Right now, we have a bill for, safer prescribing standards, so that we have people who are educated in prescribing a narcotic like an opioid. We also have a bill to help with the waiver on medically assisted treatment. A lot of times, primary care physicians meet someone who's struggling with addiction, and whether it's their primary care visit or in a clinic or in an emergency room or whatnot, and they don't actually have the training to help that person. Now, every time I go to the doctor, they ask me if I feel safe at home, right? And that was born out of this focus on eradicating domestic abuse, right? And putting it in the hands of, if you've got a moment where you're in contact or engaged with your healthcare provider, that is an opportunity where we can help diagnose and prescribe. And I think we have to do the same thing with addiction. And so we're working on those bills. We're going to drop the second one that I described in terms of helping with medically assisted treatment and primary care physicians having the tools they need and the education that they need to help diagnose addiction and then treat it. We're doing that this month. So, we're really going to work. I get to sit with a group of committed Republicans and Democrats. It's the Freshman Working Group on Addiction. And we do view our role as a catalyst for keeping this at the forefront. And I serve in a district that's disproportionately affected by this crisis. And so I consider it my job to make sure that I'm harnessing the energy of this freshman class to make sure that we make progress.
I hope you're enjoying your summer somewhat.
Just by virtue of the fact that I'm home, I spend 4 nights a week when I'm in Washington. I've got 5 and 9-year-old daughters, and so that takes a toll. They're well adjusted, but you always have that teary FaceTime. And right now, I whether it's seeing them in the morning for breakfast or tucking them into bed, I mean, nothing beats that. It feeds your soul. So it's enough. It's enough for me.